Then said he, "Your pardon, sir, I marked you not, for I was listening to the birds. Indeed, sir, you find me in a sour temper, for lo, here I have a black-winged rogue fat with impudence, who singeth songs before unknown to me, and in a tongue that is strange. It irks me, sir, it irks me, for methought at least I knew the simple speeches of all birds. I have a mind to send him down to Mandos for his pertness." At this Eriol laughed heartily, but said the door-ward, "Nay, sir, may Telvidal, prince of cats, harry him for daring to perch in a garden that is in the care of Rumil. Know you that the Nodoli grow old astounding slow, and yet have I grey hairs in the study of all the tongues of the Valar and of Eldar. Long ere the fall of Gondolin, good sir, I lightened my thraldom under Melko, in learning the speech of all monsters and goblins. Have I not conned even the speeches of beasts, disdaining not the thin voices of the voles and mice? Have I not cadged a stupid tune or two to hum of the speechless beetles? Nay, I have worried at whiles even over the tongues of men, but Melko take them, they shift and change and shift, and when you have them are but a hard stuff whereof to labour songs or tales. Wherefore is it that this morn I felt as Omar the Vala, who knows all tongues, as I hearkened to the blending of the voices of the birds, comprehending each, recognizing each well-loved tune, when Tiripti Lirilla here comes a bird, an imp of Melko. But I weary you, sir, with babblings of songs and words." "Nay, not so," quoth Eriol, "but I beg of you, be not disheartened by one fat imp of an ousel. If my eyes deceive not, for a good age of years you have cared for this garden. Then must you know store of songs and tongues sufficient to comfort the heart of the greatest of all sages, if indeed this be the first voice that you have heard therein and lacked its interpretation. Is it not said that the birds of every district, nay, of almost of every nest, speak unlike?" "'Tis said so, and said truly," quoth Rumil, "and all the songs of Tolarizea are to be heard at times within this garden." Welcome, I'm Professor Rachel Fulton Brown, and this is The Forge of Tolkien. I promised you that we would be in the stories now, and here we are in the Book of Lost Tales. This is the next story, the Cottage of Lost Play we talked about last time, and now we have this intervening passage between the Cottage of Lost Play, the setup where Eriol is wandering and finds himself crouching down and going into the fairy house and finding that it's a great hall of stories. Now we have him sort of hanging out. And for the rest of the Book of Lost Tales, he's going to be talking to his hosts and learning things about, what, right? Elfland, fairy, the secondary realm, something, right? It's like Tolkien is still in this very first of his storytelling exercises trying to figure out how to get us inside this world, right? And what I'd like to talk about this time is, in fact, how he's trying to do it with speech, and well, as you can tell from my stumbling at the very beginning of the reading here, doing it kind of badly, right? It's like, then he said, that's what I wanted to say when I started the reading right now, but we know we have then said he. You have, reversal of verb and noun or pronoun, the verb and the subject. Your pardon, sir, all of this highfalutin, archaizing language that when we were talking about ichor and potatoes back a few videos ago, I had the lessons that Ursula Le Guin gave us about writing fantasy, and here we are reading something that I am certain that if I read it to you cold out of the blue, you would probably not recognize it as Tolkien, except for the fact that, of course, that's one of the criticisms that has often been brought against his prose, even in The Lord of the Rings, that he was, even in his most mature fantasy writing something that was purposefully archaizing and purposefully twee, right? And he has a letter that he wrote to his one of his friends, to Hugh Brogan, Brogan had written to Tolkien in 1954, criticizing Tolkien for his archaic narrative style in parts of The Two Towers, specifically the chapter on Theoden and the King of the Golden Hall, when the travelers, Gandalf and Aragorn and Gimli and Legolas, show up at Meduseld and have to confront Theoden, bespelled by Wormtongue. And this whole episode, as far as Brogan was concerned, was hopelessly archaizing. He called this style, this is Carpenter's intro to the letter, which we're going to work through a little bit, but Brogan calls the style that Tolkien used in this chapter particularly oceanic, meaning partaking in that late 18th century faux fantasy storytelling that there are a number of heroic legends that are told in that period, right? The oceanic legends being some of the most popular. Some of them, I realized I forgot to look it up. I could tell you later. Be like, checking now while you're listening, that these late 18th century fictional voices, Walter Scott is to a certain extent playing off of them and criticizing them at the same time, that you're trying to write historical fiction in this style that feels resonant of the period that you're actually describing. And Brogan is saying basically Tolkien simply failed. Brogan says he agreed with the critic's description of it as tushery, and then at first Tolkien doesn't write back, and then about almost a year later, September 1955, Brogan writes again, apologizes for being impertinent, stupid, or sycophantic. Like, whether Brogan counts as a gamma in this, right? Hard to say, because Tolkien was, as I think I am, probably infinitely more patient with the gamma tendencies than probably Vox or Owen are. I think of, these are teaching opportunities, and I need to be more practiced to figuring out exactly when people are just getting at me to prove their superiority to my professorial knowledge, and when they're asking me sincere questions. I'm confessing that I am, in these days of the recount and the narrative breaking and so forth, a little pricklier than maybe I am, I don't know, in ordinary time. Are we going to be in ordinary time? In any case, Tolkien had to suffer it too, and Tolkien happily having ignored Brogan to begin with, gets an apology later, but then Tolkien drafts an answer, and it still doesn't send it, right? He says that all he did was write a brief note saying that the matter of archaism, quote, would take too long to debate in a letter and must wait till their next meeting. They did know each other in person. So what we have is the draft of the letter that Tolkien didn't send, when he's trying to justify himself for his stylistic choices, and that he didn't send the letter, suggesting that, even he, I think, has some, it's like, did I get it right? And unfortunately, that's one of the reasons that gamma trolling can have the effect that it does, because if you're a good artist, you're going to be always, practicing to improve your craft. And Tolkien definitely was doing that. And when we compare the archaizing tushery of the the Book of Lost Tales to what he comes up with in the King of the Golden Hall, and consider, we all like the Lord of the Rings, right? You're not here unless you like the Lord of the Rings. Did Tolkien succeed in the long run in solving the problems that Brogan was criticizing him for? Well, at first he says, "Dear Hugh, don't be disturbed. I have not noticed any impertinence or sycophancy in your letters, and anyone so appreciative and so perceptive is entitled to criticism. Anyway, I do not naturally breathe an air of undiluted incense." Tolkien saying, I'm not just, expecting to be worshipped in my craft, so I'm okay with the criticism. Here we go. It was not what you said, last letter but one, not the one I answered, or you're right to say it, that might have called for reply if I'd had the time for it. But the pain that I always feel when anyone, in an age when almost all arctorial manhandling of English is permitted, especially if disruptive, in the name of art or personal expression, immediately dismisses out of court deliberate archaism. It's Tolkien's saying, I'm pained when it's really the easiest criticism you can make, right? Oh, well, that, you know, how dare you? Or, you know, it must be nice to be able to speak in this fancy fashion. And Tolkien is saying, you know, I wasn't able to respond well, even to you, my friend, because it frustrates me when people immediately dismiss deliberate archaism. The proper use of tushery is to apply it to the kind of bogus medieval stuff which attempts, without knowledge, to give a supposed temporal color with expletives, such as tush, pish, zounds, merry, and the like. So, you know, tushery, as Tolkien is describing it, is simply, you know, sort of decorating your speech with lol. He's basically saying tushery is saying lol in the wrong places. But a real archaic English is far more terse than modern. We talk about this with the I-core problem, right? That we often think of the archaizing, it should be more flowery and have more complicated, obscure vocabulary and the subjunctive and reverse word order and such. And Tolkien by 1955, is realizing true archaic language is quite tight, right? It's very tightly crafted. Also, many of things said could not be said in our slack and often frivolous idiom. That we don't actually have the capacity in our modern idiom to say the kinds of things that you would need to say in order to write of a past time, right? Of course, not being especially well read in modern English and far more familiar with works in the ancient and middle idioms, my own ear is to some extent affected. It's like, that's nonsense. He's of course, Tolkien read just as much in modern English as anybody else, but he spent so much more time with the old and middle English models that he's playing off of. He's affected, and I find that too. A good deal of my own scholarship has been in not so much direct translation as paraphrase, because I'm trying, precisely because I mean a good scholar should be able to paraphrase so as to make clear to a modern ear the kinds of things that are said in the older expressions. I'm usually working from Latin into English, medieval Latin into modern English, and I'm usually very concerned with particularly like in translations of Bible passages, keeping the sense of the Latin into the modern English so that you can understand why the medieval commentators give the particular interpretation that they do to the text that they have in front of them in Latin. And therefore you have to sort of pass around all of the different layers of translation that the scriptures have gone through to get to our ear, so that if I just gave you the Revised Standard Version and then said that's what this commentary is about, you'd miss it, right? So Tolkien, having trained as a scholar in this fashion and being infinitely more skilled than I am linguistically, it's mind-bogglingly so, he's saying, my ear, I'm working with the older forms, the older idioms, and I don't know whether he's saying I can't write properly in modern English, but just I fall into the older idioms more easily. So that though I could easily recollect how a modern would put this or that, what comes easiest to mind or pen is not quite that. Take an example from the chapter that you specially singled out and called terrible, Book 3, The King of the Golden Hall. "Nay, Gandalf," said the king, "you do not know your own skill in healing. It shall not be so. I myself will go to war, to fall in the front of the battle, if it must be. Thus shall I sleep better." Okay, so this is, Tolkien's taken a particular passage, and that's what I'd like to do, sort of comparing the tushery, if there is any, or definitely the archaisms in his his Book of Lost Tales, the earliest attempt at this exercise, with the scene in The King of the Golden Hall, and say, if you wanted to write like Tolkien or figure out what it is he was doing, what would you have to shift in very little fashion, right? So at this point with Brogan, he's talking about why that statement that Theoden makes actually matters, that it's slightly archaic or archaized in the way that Tolkien wrote it. So he says, this is a fair sample, moderated or watered archaism. Using only words that still are used or known to the educated, the king would really have said, nay, because of course the problem with the Rohirrim is that they're supposed to be Anglo-Saxons, right? That they are, and I think Tolkien, when he's writing the Book of Lost Tales, is still not, is still not quite sure where he is in the time period that he's trying to write, and he's still inventing it. I'm looking for the speech of the Rohirrim. Second. So the men in The Lord of the Rings speak a number of different dialects or tongues, right? And the Gondorians speak Númenorian, basically, but the Rohirrim say, from the lands between the Glad and the Carrick came the folk that were known in Gondor as the Rohirrim, masters of horses. They still spoke their ancestral tongue and gave new names in it to nearly all the places in their new country, and they called themselves the Earlings, or men of the Riddermark. But the lords of that people used the common speech freely and spoke it nobly after the manner of their allies in Gondor. For in Gondor, whence it came, the Westron kept still a more gracious and antique style, which is the premise being that the Rohirrim are themselves a more sort of rustic or Anglo-Saxon-ish version of the Gondorian high elevated elite speech, right? So what Tolkien is playing off of, this archaism that he's going to give Theoden, is like, I guess the Anglo-Saxon is compared to Rome, roughly, something like that. But nay, thou knowest not thine own skill in healing. It shall not be so. I myself will go to war, to fall, etc. Now recognize there where he's telling his friend Hugh Brogan, that if I had tried to write this in the oldie-fashionedy speechy that you claim I'm doing, it would be even more sort of labored. And that is, in fact, what Tolkien did when he first started writing. It's like I read you that little bit of speech about that conversation between Eriol and Rumil, who in the Book of Lost Tales is the door warden, but in later iterations of the Silmarillion, what becomes the Silmarillion, will become the main storyteller. And it's interesting, there's a number of different story levels that are interesting here, that Eriol is wandering around the garden. There's that the sort of problem that he has with this particular bird. I'm listening to the birds. I have a black-winged rogue, fat with impudence, who singeth songs. Oh, sorry, no, sorry. It's Rumil speaking, and Eriol laughs, and Rumil is saying, I didn't notice you. It's even hard for me to figure out what's going on in these passages. That Rumil had been listening to another bird, and I'm upset. He's upset because he doesn't understand the speech of the birds. Well, it's interesting that in this earliest version of the story, you have a character who can talk to animals, which, Radagast, I suppose, can talk to animals, and he's one of the wizards. But for the most part, in the later stories, that's not as strong a feature, right? That early on, Tolkien has the more fairy world expectation that one of the things you do is talk to the birds and the beasts. But interestingly, here we have Rumil as previously the slave of Melkor, of Morgoth, right? So Tolkien is not even yet clear exactly. I mean, he's making this up as he's going along, right? Obviously, and it is interesting how many of the names of the characters we already have in place. We have the fall of Gondolin, which he's already imagined, and the Valar and the Eldar. But Rumil, this storytelling door warden who listens to birds, was in thrall under Melko, right? Who is the Morgoth, who is the enemy, right? And somehow he's no longer, he says, I lighten my thraldom under Melko in learning the speech of all monsters and goblins. Again, there's a, Tolkien is worried about this transmission of story, so that presumably Rumil knows stuff because he was there with the Valar. He's under thrall to Melko, and he's able to talk to not only birds and beasts but monsters, and that he's made a study of all of these different tongues, and learning like Omar the Valar, who knows all tongues, the different speeches, and he's frustrated that he doesn't know this particular bird. Okay, so it's delightful for our purposes because it's a conversation about learning the speech of all these different kinds of creatures within a passage that's hilariously archaizing and labored, and trying to capture that sense of speech. That they give you another. It's like it is all like this, and I do want you to sort of remember how hard Tolkien worked to develop the style that you appreciate he writes in, and how many false starts there were in terms simply like word order, right? So we have Eriol wanting to, they've been telling tales around the tail fire, and they're going to go to bed, and Eriol says he's sleepy, and they say, do you want to stick around? And he says, no, I'll stay. Think not that you must leave our house tomorrow if need, the hostess said, for none do so. Nay, all may remain while a tale remains to tell which they desire to hear. Then said Eriol that all desire of faring abroad had left his heart, and that to be a guest there a while seemed to him fairest of all things. Thereupon came in those that bore the candles of sleep, and each of that company took one, and two of the folk of the house bade Eriol follow them. One of these was the door ward, that's Rumil, who we've just been talking to, who had opened to his knocking before. He was old in appearance, and grey of locks, and few of that folk were so. But the other had a weather-worn face, and blue eyes of great merriment, and was very slender and small, nor might one say if he were 50 or 10,000. Now that was Ilverin or Little Heart. These two guided him down the corridor of broidered stories to a great stair of oak, and up this he followed them. It wound up and round until it brought them to a passage lit by small pendant lamps of colored glass, whose swaying cast a spatter of bright hues upon the floors and hangings. I challenge you to pick this book up and read that better, right? It's so fascinating how impossible these early stories are simply to read out loud. I love reading Tolkien. You know that. I'm doing this series of videos mainly so I can read you stories, right? I love reading Tolkien, and his earlier exercises are impossible to read. I bet you wish we were reading Tom Bombadil right now. Now compare that, what I just read, that the sort of just amazingly labored archaism of one of these was the door ward who had opened to his knocking before. He was so old in appearance and grey of locks, and few of that folk were so. Compare that to the company walking into the throne room at Meduseld, and just, I want you to hear, so both of these are archaized, right? And Brogan was criticizing Tolkien specifically for being overly archaizing in this King of the Golden Hall passage, but there is a difference. There's a massive difference, and I hope you can hear it as I read. Okay. Now the four companions went forward, past the clear wood fire burning upon the long hearth in the midst of the hall. Then they halted. At the far end of the house, beyond the hearth and facing north towards the doors, was a dais with 3 steps, and in the middle of the dais was a great gilded chair. Upon it sat a man so bent with age that he seemed almost a dwarf, but his white hair was long and thick and fell in great braids from beneath a thin golden circlet set upon his brow. In the center upon his forehead shone a single white diamond. His beard was laid like snow upon his knees, but his eyes still burned with a bright light, glinting as he gazed at the strangers. Behind his chair stood a woman clad in white. At his feet upon the steps sat a wizened figure of a man with a pale, wise face and heavy-lidded eyes. There was a silence. The old man did not move in his chair. At length Gandalf spoke. "Hail, Theoden, son of Thingol! I have returned, for behold, the storm comes, and now all friends should gather together, lest each singly be destroyed." Slowly the old man rose to his feet, leaning heavily upon a short black staff with a handle of white bone, and now the strangers saw that, bent though he was still tall, and must in youth have been high and proud indeed. "I greet you," he said, "and maybe you look for welcome. But truth to tell, your welcome is doubtful here, Master Gandalf. You have ever been a herald of woe. Troubles follow you like crows, and ever the oftener the worse. I will not deceive you. When I heard that Shadowfax had come back riderless, I rejoiced at the return of the horse, but still more at the lack of the rider. And when Eomer brought the tidings that you had gone at last to your long home, I did not mourn. But news from afar is seldom sooth. Here you come again, and with you come evils worse than before, as might be expected. Why should I welcome you, Gandalf Stormcrow? Tell me that." Slowly he sat down again in his chair. That is completely different. Do you see how loving it's like that rippled off the tongue? It was archaic, right? There's loads of wonderful archaisms in there. Even the Gandalf Stormcrow being the most prominent, but and things like the expressions hail and for behold. Where else? Those are things that Gandalf says, right? So hail Theoden, that hail as a word, it's like hi, howdy. There's grandeur and archaism in it, but it doesn't. It's not zounds, right, or lol. It's appropriate to the mood that Tolkien is trying to create in this scene, and yet it doesn't trip you up as badly as I don't even know where in the opening passage when it was, "Your pardon, sir, I marked you not, for I was listening to the birds. Indeed, sir, you find me in a sour temper, for lo," right? There's something else that Tolkien has refined down into this magnificent gold of his style that is greater than simply the choice of these archaisms. So, you know, as I was reading it, I was thinking of different word choices that he made. Like Herald of Woe, that sounds quite regal and magnificent. Seldom sooth, right? Sooth is not a word that we tend to use in ordinary speech these days. There was another one that I remember. I will find some more. Well, actually, interestingly, it's hard, right? Most of these words I'm looking on as I was reading it, I felt this is archaic speech. This is there's a word I don't use very much, and then when I'm trying to go back through, dais is not a particularly common word. A circlet, you know, he's got a diamond on his, but it's just circlet. That's snow. Clad. We don't tend to say clad. Clad is definitely an archaizing word. Wizened, heavy-lidded. It's actually, interestingly, relatively difficult in this supposedly high archaizing scene to find odd vocabulary, right? And that is, it's interesting that that's what Tolkien said to Brogan, that using only words that are still known or used to the educated. So, to us professorial types, or to the people who pride themselves on having obscure vocabularies, we might have said, nay, thou'st not, I can't even say, it's like, nay, thou, in parentheses, wast, W-O-S-T, which we have a footnote for in 71. Second person singular of I wot, with an optional double negative. No, I don't, thou knowest not, knowest not thine own skill in healing. It shall not be so. I myself will go to war to fall. And that's Tolkien's example of how, if I really wanted to, wrestle this into some kind of impossible archaism, I would have done it. If you want me, Tolkien goes on, to write this as a modern reader would expect it to be said, and this goes back to the way that Le Guin talked about, how much fantasy is written in a style that it is simply, I would say, a modern social realist, political narrative, typically, right? It's like, really, if all you need to do is go through and change all the nouns, and you're in a different world, then at this style level, you're not achieving any sort of great craft, right? But Tolkien proving that he, it's like, what do you want me to say? I know well enough what a modern would say. Again, giving Theoden the option of saying this passage as if he was just speaking now, right? Colloquially, as I'm speaking to you, for example. Not at all, my dear G. You don't know your own skill as a doctor. Things aren't going to be like that. I shall go to the war in person, even if I have to be one of the first casualties. Right, do you want... it's like, do you want basically the Blackadder version? No, Blackadder is actually pretty well scripted in the sense of giving us some sense of being in Elizabethan or Regency or World War I period. But, it isn't Tolkien making the point here is what do you say when you want it to be believable or easily readable and not precious and labored? He says, and then what? And this is for Tolkien what the problem truly was. If you try to write it in a modern idiom, all you get are modern thoughts. You can't translate the worldview of your archaic characters into a modern idiom and expect to appreciate the reality that your character was actually participating in, which, I was talking about what I do in my own scholarship and trying to make sure that I'm translating the scriptures from the Latin that I'm reading so that the Latin commentary that I'm paraphrasing for you makes sense in its own mode. It's very, very hard when people have gotten used to hearing certain passages in their modern idiom to then appreciate, and this isn't just, okay, so it isn't just the scholarly problem of reading in context, right? And I have been reading a lot over the last several months about the problem of say reading Jesus in his actual engagement with his interlocutors in the day, specifically the Pharisees, and understanding why he ended up in the kinds of arguments that he did with them, right? And it's like, how do you translate the thing that Jesus was worried about in trying to convince people not to go along with sort of ridiculous elaborations of particular practices. Say, for example, picking grain on the Sabbath, and the Pharisees would come to him and say, that's you're not allowed to do that. And Jesus is saying, I'm hungry, my friends are hungry, and we're eating, right? And God did not make the Sabbath so that we couldn't eat. He made it for man to not make the Sabbath for man for the Sabbath. He made the Sabbath for man, right? That if you're trying to understand what those stories, those ancient stories mean, and all you do is translate them into modern idioms, do you capture what it is that they're actually meaning, or do you obscure it? I've been thinking about this, obviously, because of the mask wearing, right, and the degree to which mask wearing has this kind of Pharisaic sort of ritual quality, right, and to go against that is considered very, very dangerous. And this is a bit of a footnote, right, but I'm thinking Jesus is struggling with similar sorts of practices, right, that they become highly elaborate by his day, and everybody's convinced that they're absolutely necessary, but he's showing them that no, they're sort of surrounded by magic spells. But that's a different that's a different argument. What Tolkien is trying to do is say the idiom that you choose to tell the story in actually affects what you're able to get the characters to think about in their worldview. This is more like, and I have I keep bracketing things that I want to talk to you about, because I realize I need to keep laying some more. Like, we're on a journey, and I want to get you over there, but to get you there, I have to lay paving down a bit so that there's a path to follow, right? If we're going to get there. And one of the things that we need to get to is Tolkien's stories of creation, which we're aiming at, and I mean, very specifically the intro that I'm worrying about with this old speech that we're talking about is in fact, as I said, a linking passage between the Cottage of the Lost Play and the earliest version that we have of Tolkien's creation story, the music of the Aenir, right? So that we're actually trying to get. I mean, it's an interesting, because we're always thinking in Christian terms, because we are, and Tolkien is wrestling here, as we have previously, but I'm just going to keep coming back to it because it helps get you further and further and further into the problem, I think. We're trying to figure out how you create with speech, obviously, and how the longing that I started with at the very beginning of this series, which is always going to be an aspect of what we're talking about, of how do you find yourself in the story, right? And I'm really now hoping that all y'all are watching Owen's live streams too, because I keep hearing things that he's saying there and saying, yes, that's what I've been talking about. Also, the being in the story, right? Being in the same story that Tolkien has his characters longing for. Sam and Frodo on the stairs of Cirith Ungol, recognizing themselves in this great tale, in the tale that in Tolkien's own crafting of his legendarium began with the Book of Lost Tales, but Sam there figuring out that they, as hobbits, who are also always, so we're going to get creation story, but we're also getting to the hobbits, who are the story framers, get us into that incarnate tale, right? It's as big as the difference between the flat earth and the sphere earth. And bear listeners, you will enjoy the fact that, of course, maybe some of you know that Tolkien did actually wrestle with this in his own storytelling, because he goes from a world that is flat, right? That Tolkien's original imagining of his story world is a flat earth, and then at a certain point in the crafting of the legendarium, he has it bent, right? And then he tries to have both, right? He tries to have the early period of the legendarium when the world is flat, and it's, after one of the interventions of the gods that you end up with Sphere Earth. So that now when we try to make the journey that he's always setting his characters on, like Eriol, this very first one, right? Although Eriol in his first travels just goes basically from Denmark to England, I think, roughly, right? He goes from the land where Beowulf, the actual Beowulf poem, was probably originally sung, told, whatever, but it's set, right? Beowulf is set in basically Denmark and Sweden. And Tolkien has Eriol travel from Denmark to England, and the Cottage of Lost Play we talked about last time. Tol Eressëa is England, Warwickshire. He's in our land. Tolkien will keep wrestling with this, and he basically wants his characters to have, and that's what I'm going to be working up to getting you to. Sorry, I had it there a second ago. Right, that his original construction of his world, his story world, is you travel west, and that it's this straight shot west to the Blessed Lands, but by the time of the Lord of the Rings, the world's been bent, and so when they travel west, it's like in real world the sphere falls away, but say Frodo and Gandalf on the last ship into the west goes to ferry, and that's why it's so hard to get there. Footnote. Right, and that one of the things that Tolkien is wrestling with in this crafting of what world he's in is saying, how do the characters themselves in their idiom express the reality of creation that they understand and experience. That's what he's trying to show you with these different versions of what Theoden could say, wouldn't say in a modern idiom, and actually did say. So let's read those back through, right? So the example that we're going to get to is, well, let's say, I was also thinking about this Wormtongue passage because it feels to me like, it's very easy for people to get caught by bad counselors, right? And so how many Theodens with their Wormtongues do we have losing heart in this exact moment in our own story, so that we find ourselves, I guess that's another layer, we find ourselves in Tolkien's story over and over and over again by recognizing the truth of these interactions. And Tolkien is trying to figure out, by way of his idiom, how to get you in that recognition. So it doesn't work if it's just archaizing, and as it is in the Book of Lost Tales, aversive, right? It's impossible to read, and I'm gonna in a moment take you through why it's so hard and stupid. But he's trying to make it archaic and yet make you still, through his craft, be in that world that he's giving voice to, right? Okay, so I just read that the Gandalf greets Theoden. Theoden manages to stand up and say, you don't come with good tidings. And Gandalf is then Wormtongue is going to speak. "You speak justly, Lord," said the pale man sitting upon the steps of the dais. "It is not yet 5 days since the bitter tidings came that Theodred, your son, was slain upon the west marches. Your right hand, second marshal of the Mark. In Éomer there is little trust. Few men would be left to guard your walls if he had been allowed to rule. And even now we learn from Gondor that the Dark Lord is stirring in the east. Such is the hour in which this wanderer chooses to return. Why indeed should we welcome you, Master Stormcrow? Lathspell I name you, ill news. And ill news is an ill guest, they say." He laughed grimly as he lifted his heavy lids for a moment and gazed on the strangers with dark eyes. "You are held wise, my friend Wormtongue, and are doubtless a great support to your master," answered Gandalf in a soft voice. "Yet in 2 ways may a man come with evil tidings. He may be a worker of evil, or he may be such as leaves well alone. and comes only to bring aid in time of need. That is so, said Wormtongue, but there is a third kind, picker of bones, meddlers in other men's sorrows, carrion fowl that grow fat on war. What aid have you ever brought, Stormcrow, and what aid do you bring now? It was aid from us that you sought last time that you were here. Okay, but I'm getting you to pay attention to the structuring of the world through the very specific diction that they have, and that when Theoden first speaks, he's still under Wormtongue's spell. Wormtongue speaks, Gandalf speaks, and then Gandalf heals him, right? So that we get to the point where the passage that Tolkien is giving as an example. So, nay, Gandalf, said the king, you do not know your own skill in healing. It shall not be so. I myself will go to war, to fall in the front of the battle if it must be. Thus shall I sleep better. And Tolkien says, well, okay, if I was doing this super archaizing, we go, the nay, now is non thy own skill in healing. But that would not be as effective as what he had Theoden say. But neither would it be effective for Theoden to speak like a modern man, right? Not at all, my dear G. Not at all, my dear G, just the letter, right? You don't know your own skill as a doctor. Things aren't going to be like that. I shall go to the war in person, even if I have to be one of the first casualties. Now, see, there's that Tolkien has managed, by the time he's writing The Lord of the Rings, to fix a lot of the problems that he gave himself in the Cottage of Lost Play, but he still doesn't end up just writing it in modern speech, and he's explaining to Brogan why not. And then what? He says, Theoden would certainly think and probably say, thus shall I sleep better. But people who think like that just do not talk a modern idiom. Right? That's the problem. If you think of the world differently, flat maybe, I don't know, given a different kind of responsibility, different kind of burden, in reality, you're not going to speak in the same way, Tolkien's arguing, as you would a modern person with modern convictions about the meaning of life. So he says, you can have, I shall lie easier in my grave, or I should sleep sounder in my grave, like that, rather than if I stayed at home, if you like. But there would be an insincerity of thought, a disunion of word and meaning. For a king who spoke in a modern style would not really think in such terms at all, and any reference to sleeping quietly in the grave would be a deliberate archaism of expression on his part, however worded, far more bogus than the actual archaic English that I have used. It's interesting, right? He's saying, if I used the phrase that you would expect a modern speaker to use in talking about what happens after death, right? What he has, Theoden says, is, thus shall I sleep better. And, what if Theoden was speaking like a modern person and said, well, I shall lie easier in my grave? Tolkien is saying that's actually a bigger lie than the archaism. And the archaism he doesn't think is a lie at all, right? He's saying it's basically a lie to have Theoden, who doesn't think in these terms, speak in a modern idiom. But it's what's interesting, for a king who spoke in a modern style would not really think in such terms at all. And any reference to sleeping quietly in the grave would be a deliberate archaism of expression on his part, like some non-Christian making a reference to some Christian belief which did not, in fact, move him at all. Now, I love this passage, and then you realize when I make the argument that Tolkien is throughout, I think throughout he's thinking biblically, so I probably have to probably have to prove that to you a little more robustly than just asserting it all the time. But I think it's at this level of, one, Tolkien read the scriptures enough that they're just seeping into his storytelling mode. But he also, lives the stories, lives the Christian story, lives the Bible story so deeply that he's going to be irked by modern people using Christian expressions and not really meaning them, right? It's like if you say, I shall lie easier in my grave, the premise being, that Tolkien doesn't explain this here, right? He's just assuming that Brogan would understand it. If you say, I'm sleeping, I'm lying easier in my grave, you're waiting for the resurrection, right? There is an expectation of a future life. If you make such phrases like R.I.P., rest in peace, I mean, the full phrasing is, may he rest in peace and rise in glory. You don't just die, rest, and then rest for what, right? It's the rest in peace, the resquiescat in pace, sorry. It should be, I shouldn't try to show off Latin and then not ever reminding myself whether it's ablative or accusative, right? Into peace versus in peace. See, it's like Tolkien would know when you are using the phraseology of even sleeping in your grave to mean something that is, in our own phrasing, faux it's not even, it's how is it backwards? It's a deliberative archaism. For a king who spoke in the modern style would not really think in such terms at all, and any reference to sleeping quietly in the grave would be a deliberate archaism of expression on his part, far more bogus than the actual archaic English I have used. It would be bogus for a king speaking in the modern style to talk about sleeping in his grave, because the modern idiom erases that reality. So he goes on to talk about some other choices that he made, but that when Tolkien is striving for his archaic style, he's also striving for a worldview that style participates in, and he chides Brogan at the end of this. Specifically, he's talked about things like word choices like helms and choosing helmets, and also word order, and I do want to talk about that, but concluding with being frustrated with Brogan. I'm sorry to find you affected by the extraordinary 20th century delusion that its usages per se, and simply as contemporary, irrespective of whether they are terser, more vivid, or even nobler, have some peculiar validity above those of all other times, so that not to use them, even when quite unsuitable in tone, is a solecism, a gaffe, a thing at which one's friends shudder or feel hot in the collar. Shake yourself out of this parochialism of time. Also, not to be too donnish, learn to discriminate between the bogus and genuine antique, as you would if you hope not to be cheated by a dealer, right? So, one that it's interesting because, of course, that's one of the things that we've already talked about that the critics really dislike about Tolkien. They say it's Wagner and Winnie the Pooh, so that they dislike his archaizing and find it affected. And Tolkien's riposte is, well, why should only our mode of expression be considered? Well, I don't know. It's like it's sort of socially acceptable, right? Because solecism or gaffe or things that would friends shudder. It's like embarrassing. It's embarrassing to try to write in this other style. It's embarrassing to try to break out of the contemporary idiom. How dare you try to say something that we in our current speech don't, it's like literally don't have the words for. Literally don't have not just the conception of it, but our speech has been so wrenched away from the reality that previous idiom was an expression of. We can't even say it. We have no words for saying what that past reality not just felt like, right? But I think it's like Tolkien sets it up. It's like distinguishing between a bogus and genuine antique, or we've encountered this problem before too, when Tolkien is trying to say, how much of this is time travel, how much of it is uh, into a different realm travel. Just the difference between, is this a primary reality versus secondary reality of primary world and fairy, or is it a temporal travel, which we talked about with the Notion Club papers, that he's thinking in terms of, if only I could get back in time, but then it would, blend from history into myth. That you realize constantly wanting to have the world flat and spherical at the same time, I think, and trying to find the idiom that could get you to mediate between those two, so that there's this constant kind of shimmering. It's not duality, right? It's the best catchphrase I still have for it is the Christian understanding of heaven and earth, but that's not really it either, right? It's the sense of, if you could see yourself through this idiom, if you can get yourself into this idiom so effectively, it itself will require you to think of reality differently, which will make it, it's like, remember that what we're always trying to do here is get into fairy, right? It's like the Cottage of the Lost play. Eriol is there. He's trying to understand what it's like to see this new mythology. He's trying to understand, now we're going to get to the creation of the world through music, and with these gods, right? He ends up opening with this little passage actually begins with Eriol asking this question. But, said Eriol, still there are many things that remain dark to me. Indeed, I would fain know who be these Valar. Are they the gods? Right? That we are trying to figure out creation all along, and that he ends up in this little conversation with Rumil in the garden is like Adam knowing the speech of the animals, and being able to talk to the birds, and being Rumil kind of Adamically frustrated that he can't understand one of them. That Tolkien is trying to figure out that way to effect for you that passage into this transformed understanding. And I think I've been enjoying listening to Owen talk about the flat earth problem, and have looked. It's like Tolkien is effectively trying to make you make that transition from seeing the world as you've been told it was, spherical, not only, in fact, everybody in the Middle Ages thought the world was round because Dante said so. No, Dante describes a globe that his story takes place in, and there's a proof of it because Satan is literally at the center of the globe. And when Dante and Virgil go to the bottom of hell, they see Satan stuck in the ice, and he's flapping his wings, so it's really cold. Hell's frozen. Hell is already frozen over, if you didn't know. And they first, to get to the opposite side of the story, as it were, to go from hell to purgatory, they have to climb down Satan's sides. But at the midpoint, either his belly button or his groin, I can't remember which it was. Now I want to know. I have to look it up. At the midpoint, they flip, right? And so they're climbing down Satan's sides. They get to the middle, and then they're climbing up his legs. Dante was very, very clear that the earth was round, a sphere, and purgatory was on the opposite side of the globe. So all Galileo does is make the Copernican argument that the earth is going round the sun, but the spherical story is there in the Middle Ages. And of course Tolkien would have known this, right? He's trying to give you a story, we'll get to that, we'll give you a story of creation that is, in his opening moves, going to make it flat so that he can have that journey out to the west and end up in Fairy, in Valinor, or the land of the Valar, which he's trying to learn about in these very early Lost Tales. And Tolkien is trying to get you through his idiom, his style, into that flat earth, as it were. And we do it, by way of making I saw an experiment with the lake, right? And you're making sightings across the water with lasers and things like that. We do it mathematically and with measurements. Tolkien is trying to get you into that different understanding of reality and make it that real, right? Make it so that you've gone from thinking globe earth to flat earth by way of gray of locks and few of that folk were the idiom, right? It doesn't work in the Book of Lost Tales, and it's interesting. It's like it's just badly written, which is, Tolkien thought so too because he kept rewriting it. So, fair enough, right? But there is so it's not just in the things he's describing, right? Because he's got the Eriol's in the house. They take him down a corridor that's covered with tapestries that we've already seen. We talked about that last time. It's wooden stairs. There's lamps with colored glass, and the lights shattering all over the pavement. In this passage, the guides turn round a sudden corner, then going down a few dark steps, flung open a door before him. Now bowing, they wished him good sleep, and said, "Little heart, dreams of fair winds and good voyages in the great seas." And then they left him, and he found that he stood in a chamber that was small, and had a bed of fairest linen and deep pillows set nigh the window, and here the night seemed warm and fragrant, though he had but now come from rejoicing in the blaze of the tale-fire logs. Here was all the furniture of dark wood, and as his great candle flickered, its soft rays worked a magic with the room, till it seemed to him that sleep was the best of all delights, but that fair chamber the best of all for sleep. Ere he laid him down, however, Eriol opened the window, and scent of flowers gusted in therethrough. And a glimpse he caught of a shadow-filled garden that was full of trees, but its spaces were barred with silver lights and black shadows by reason of the moon. Yet his window seemed very high indeed above those lawns below, and a nightingale sang suddenly in a tree nearby. Okay, so we've described a room that's got a bed and some pillows and a window and candlelight, and you can look out the window and smell flowers, and there's a garden, and right? It's an ordinary setting, and yet Tolkien's trying to sort of pump it up, right? We're trying to get to fairy here with this like wrenching diction that he's going through. I mean, it's not just horrible words like therethrough. Everything is said badly, and I want to think about exactly why it's and it's funny because I'll be reading it out, stumble over something, then want to go back and think, where did I actually stumble? But here was all the furniture of dark wood, and as his great candle flickered, its soft rays worked a magic with the room. It's too hard to say, right? And what's interesting, and Tolkien does become very, very sensitive to this later, that there's an archaism in it's not just the sort of word order and funky words and stuff like that. It's the alliteration, right? And if you realize that he's done it at this amazingly subtle level, but once you start paying attention to it, you realize it's perfectly crafted, that everything in The King of the Golden Hall sounds like Old English poetry, right? Let's see, we'll pick something. This is the I found Psalm 86, which is one of my favorite psalms, translated from the Paris Psalter, which is an Old English translation of the Psalms, by Craig Williamson, our great translator of Old English, into a modern idiom that's trying to capture what that Old English one is like. It's like, his foundations hold up the holy mountains, for the Lord has always loved the gates of Zion more than the great houses of Jacob. Glorious things are said about you, O Jerusalem, that you are the loveliest of the Lord's cities. That's there's a few examples of that in there, but let me find another one. This is better. Okay, this is a poem called The Order of the World, which is about creation. Are you willing to trade talk with a stranger, give a seer or singer, poet or prophet, a greeting, a welcome with wise words? Question the far traveler about creation, its natural power, its bodying forth into everyday wonder through God's grace, its life-quickening capacity and clout, its marvelous moving among men. Each waking wonder is a telling token to the man who understands the wide world, holds a map in his holds a map in his mind, comprehending the shape of creation and contemplating the past, knowing that long ago warriors and poets could weave truth in proverbs and prophecies, their measure of melodies the warp and weft of song, so that through their repeating, rehearsing, revising, men might remember this web of mysteries, God's gift of world wonders, of life's rich riddles, of the deep down shaping, sustaining spirit. So let the deeply thinking man, seeker and seer, who reflects on the seminal secrets of creation, unlock his word hoard, inscribe for the world's understanding the art and craft of narration, the treasure of a good story, the gift of signifying song. A wise man never grows weary of watching wonders, of contemplating this grand creation, of acting wholly and wisely in the world. Understand this lesson, learn this lore. Okay, that's what Tolkien is trying to model, right? That is when he is thinking about. This is from the Exeter book. It's simply one of my favorites, which is probably why it opened there. From the Exeter book, so from the same manuscript that the Eriol poem came from, right? The Advent lyrics. That when Tolkien is thinking about to himself, right? And we had him telling Hugh Brogan that far more familiar with works in the ancient and middle idioms, right? This is again, I've been telling you, anything I pull out of this book, Tolkien had memorized, I'm positive, and that he is trying to write his story eventually of creation, but this invitation, this are you willing to trade talk with a stranger, give a seer or singer, poet or prophet a greeting, a welcome with wise words, that he is trying in his Book of Lost Tales to give you that sense of being in, I think, in this idiom, right, in this Old English idiom, and he doesn't quite know how to do it, or he hasn't figured it out yet. In his 20s, in his early one, and he tends to fall into what I realize the most tedious construction he uses is of, right? Old in appearance and gray of locks. Few of that folk were so. Great stair of oak, blah blah blah. It's like the of that is as bad as ichor, right? The of this, the candle of light. His furniture of dark wood, soft rays worked a magic with the room. He's just trying to tell you it's magic, and he doesn't know how to craft it yet. He doesn't know how to cast the spell. He wants to get you into his story world, but by the time he's writing the Lord of the Rings, and he's writing the King of the Golden Hall, he can do it. Let's see how well he does it. Okay, here's another description of a room, right? This is the throne room where they are. The guards now lifted the heavy bars of the doors and swung them slowly inwards, grumbling on their great hinges. Are you hearing it now, right? The travelers entered. Inside it seemed dark and warm after the clear air upon the hill. The hall was long and wide and filled with shadows and half-lights. Look, that's almost exactly what he just said in the Book of Lost Tales, right? It's, remember, the furniture of dark wood, a great candle, chamber, fairest linen, deep pillows, blah, blah, blah. It's like obviously rooms have these characteristics, right? And he's giving you the characteristics of this room, but it's going to work this time, right? It's going to be much more effective. Inside, it seemed dark and warm after the clear air upon the hill. The hall was long and wide and filled with shadows and half-lights. The mighty pillars upheld its lofty roof. But here and there bright sunbeams fell in glimmering shafts from the eastern windows, high under the deep eaves. Through the louver in the roof, above the thin wisps of issuing smoke, the sky showed pale and blue. As their eyes changed, the travelers perceived that the floor was paved with stones of many hues. Branching runes and strange devices intertwined beneath their feet. They saw now that the pillars were richly carved, gleaming dully with gold and half-seen colors. Many woven cloths were hung upon the walls, and over their wide spaces marched figures of ancient legend, some dim with years, some darkling in the shade. But upon one form the sunlight fell, a young man upon a white horse. He was blowing a great horn, and his yellow hair was flying in the wind. The horse's head was lifted, and its nostrils were wide and red as it neighed, smelling battle afar. Foaming water, green and white, rushed and curled about its knees. "Behold, Eriol the young," said Aragorn. Thus he rode out of the north to the battle of the field of Celebrant. Okay, now there's some constructions in there that you'll recognize from the Book of Lost Tales and some detail. There's things like tapestry hung walls, right? And an emphasis on color and light play and so forth. But it works so much better in the description of Meduseld, partly because, one, Tolkien stopped rearranging the word order for most things. He does have things like stones of many hues, that's fine. Branching runes and strange devices intertwined beneath their feet. Instead of saying it's a magical room, he's gotten better at giving you the picture of the room rather than telling you the effect it's supposed to have on you, although sometimes he does do that. But for the most part, you get the magic in the room because it's just mysterious, right? The pillars are richly carved, gleaming dully with gold and half-seen colors. He has also, and this is the I think the most powerful archaism that is in this passage that it doesn't seem Hugh Brogan actually brought up, is the alliteration that Tolkien is using, right? So in the Old English poems, and what Williamson is trying to recreate for you here, things like, "Are you willing to trade talk with a stranger?" Willing, with. Give a seer or singer, seer, singer. Poet or prophet, poet or prophet. A greeting, a welcome with wise words, welcome, wise words. Question the far traveler about creation. The poetry of Old English depends on these alliterations, and it's much more complex than even this is happening here. It's usually three alliterations, two in the first half of the line, one in the second half, etc. Williamson's done a brilliant job maintaining as many as he has. But it's the things like, it's waking wonder, it's a telling token to a man who understands the wide world. English speakers love alliteration, and if you want to persuade people of something, pay attention to your alliteration. Tolkien wasn't doing it at all, interestingly, in the Book of Lost Tales, which I think is one of the reasons it's so hard to read, right? It's like it's shifting constantly between these consonants that make no sense together simply because the sound is wrong. Tolkien, he's trying to write music, right? We're going to get to the world of creation, the creation of the world through the music of the Aenir, but he's not going to get there unless his own prose can actually sing, right? And that, I think, is what he's definitely achieved in this chapter, The King of the Golden Hall. So we have things like okay, I'll read it out, and we've already read this passage. I'm saying, now the four companions went forward. I mean, even something as subtle as that, right? It's like, it's easier to read. Four companions went forward, past the clear wood fire, burning on the long hearth in the midst of the hall. Your ear is going to hear hearth hall, right? Then they halted. Hearth hall halted. At the far end of the house, beyond the hearth, we're still with breathing it, and facing north towards the doors was a dais with 3 steps. Doors, dais. Now you can say it. It's like you've been it's like, it is musical. It's okay, it just occurred to me as I was speaking right now, but it's like changing chords, right? You're going from hearth We got hearth, hall, halted, house, hearth. Say we're in the key, it's a G chord, right? And then we shift. Doors, dais, dais, gilded. But the great gilded, right? So we've got dais, great gilded chair. Upon it sat a man so bent with age that he seemed almost a dwarf, but his white hair was long and thick and fell in great braids from beneath a thin golden circlet set upon his brow. Braids, beneath, brow. There's this magnificent musical quality to the consonants. And consonants, one of my exercises right now, if you guys want to join me, Telegram, look for Fencing Bear at Prayer, my channel, go to the discuss, and you'll find yourself in the Dragon Comedy Room where we're writing poetry. We've been writing iambic pentameter, so we've been working with end rhyme a lot. But one of the things you have to, English is very, very powerful with, is that this alliteration and rhyme. Alliteration is like rhyming at the beginning of the word. The first consonants, or the first sound, you can write, you can alliterate with vowels too, but consonants are I realized I had to explain this when we were working with the poets to begin with, right? Rhyme, right? Vowels are the things that you can say without closing your throat, or it's like ah, e, ow, and it's like whale song, right? It's like the open sounds, right? Consonants are the clips, so that if he's, although that's a, right, you can only have it as long as a breath, right? Hearth, home, health, dais, doors. Upon it sat a man so bent with age that he seemed almost a dwarf, but his white hair was long and thick and fell in great braids from beneath a thin golden circlet set upon his brow. In the center upon his forehead shone, that's close, right? A single white diamond. So you've had white hair, white diamond. His beard was laid like snow upon his knees. So there's a very consistent color imagery that he's playing out, but it's being marked also by the consonants that you're flowing with, right? Instead of the halting, nonsensical, effort to make you see colors, which never worked. I mean, the cast a spatter of bright hues upon the floors and hangings, pendant, it's like the consonants went everywhere, the syntax went everywhere with the ofs and the reversed subject verbs and such, but the music wasn't there. Tolkien had to learn to write musical speech. That's what he was aiming at. And it's interesting that even in this earliest story, what he's aiming at is the story of creation through song, right? And we're figuring out how he made his own prose sing. His beard was laid like snow upon his knees, but his eyes still burned with a bright light. Beard burned bright. Glinting gazed at the strangers. Behind his chair stood a woman clad in white. So the clad is, it's like, okay, fancy word, right? But it's woman in white. Clad there is just a sort of, passage from what to white, right? At his feet upon the steps sat a wizened figure of a man, woman white wizened, with a pale wise face and heavy lidded eyes. I think you could make a magnificent analysis of the words that Tolkien has linked by way of these alliterations, so that we've now bound Éowyn to Wormtongue with the w, with the W's, right? It's the woman clad in white is Éowyn, and the wizened figure of a man with a pale wise face and heavy lidded eyes is Wormtongue. And of course, one of the things we find out about is the degree to which Wormtongue is worked on Éowyn. I don't think this is an accident. I think by the time Tolkien got to writing Lord of the Rings, he practiced his craft so consciously. As you can see, he's irritated with Brogan by just saying, oh, you wrote in an archaism. It was like, oh my goodness, no, I didn't. Right? I did it because the idiom carries the depth of understanding of the reality that the characters inhabit, and the idiom and the diction of the narrator, but also of the characters, carries you as the reader into the reality that Tolkien as a storyteller is trying to introduce you into. And I think I've been, I thought that when I ended last video I was going to jump to creation, but I knew I had to do this sort of passage, the passage of Eriol talking to Rumil in his bird song, which obviously is a Garden of Eden image in some way, right? That the first thing we have is he's gone into he sleeps, he wakes up morning, evening, morning, the first day or whatever day it is when he's there, and has to talk to Rumil about Rumil's knowledge of the bird song, and Rumil's upset because he can't name the particular bird, and that he has learned from Melko, which is a kind of interesting problem because that's supposed to be the Satan character, but whatever. He's learned the speech of the monsters and the goblins and also the birds, and it's going to be Rumil that tells Eriol the story of creation. So knowing the birds sing, right? Knowing the bird's song is the thing that is going to get Rumil as storyteller set up to tell Eriol, the wayfarer, the stranger, the story of creation. But to get there effectively, we need an idiom that can take you from, I think this is the best way of to take you from not just our sphere Earth, but our Copernican Galilean world to the world in which the Valar sang the song of creation. So we'll leave it there for the moment, to be continued. To be continued.